The people who smile the widest while taking everything from you always believe they'll never have to answer for it. The smell of soaked ash still clung to the cold morning air as I stood where my family home had been less than 12 hours earlier. Every familiar sound had been replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the distant hum of utility trucks and the occasional crackle of cooling timber settling into gray dust. My boots pressed into damp soil that had once been my father's front porch, and every step released the sharp scent of burnt pine mixed with wet concrete. The giant white oak my grandfather planted after returning from Korea still stood at the edge of the yard, its blackened leaves trembling in the October breeze like silent witnesses refusing to forget what happened here. Across the street, Rebecca Whitmore folded her arms with the confidence of someone who believed the story had already been written. She stood beside two members of the Willow Creek Estates HOA board wearing an immaculate cream-colored coat that somehow never seemed to collect a speck of dirt, even while surrounded by smoke and debris. Her expensive perfume drifted through the cool air every time the wind shifted, mixing strangely with the lingering odor of burnt insulation. She looked directly at me before offering a slow smile that never reached her eyes. "Such a terrible accident," she said softly, almost kindly. "Sometimes old houses simply become too dangerous to save." I didn't answer. I simply watched a firefighter hand another investigator a sealed evidence bag before they disappeared behind what remained of my garage. Rebecca mistook my silence for surrender. She always did. For months, she had insisted my property was standing in the way of the neighborhood's future. Every meeting ended with another warning, another violation notice, another reminder that progress required cooperation. According to her, my family's home lowered property values, interrupted the HOA's expansion plans, and represented an outdated past that needed to disappear. She believed enough paperwork could erase 80 years of memories. She believed enough pressure could convince me to sell. What generations of my family had built with honest work. What she never understood was that I had spent my entire career listening instead of reacting. Every unnecessary word creates another opportunity to make a mistake. Every impatient decision leaves fingerprints that facts never forget. So while neighbors whispered and cameras captured the ruins, I quietly picked up one small object lying half buried beneath gray ash near the cracked stone walkway. I brushed away the soot with my thumb before slipping it into my coat pocket without saying a word. Nobody noticed. Not Rebecca. Not the reporters setting up across the street. Not even the investigators walking through the remains with clipboards in their hands. The only sound I made was the slow exhale leaving my lungs as I looked one final time at the place where every Christmas, every birthday, every family dinner had once lived. Rebecca believed she had finally won. She climbed into her white Mercedes, closed the door with quiet satisfaction, and drove away without looking back. 3 days later, she walked into a county courtroom wearing that same confident smile, carrying a stack of folders she thought would finish the job. Then the bailiff announced, "All rise." I did not always live in Willow Creek Estates, and if you had met me 6 months before that October morning, you probably would have driven past without giving me a second glance. That was exactly how I preferred it. My name is Nathaniel Brooks. I was 48 years old, drank black coffee every morning from the same ceramic mug my late wife had given me on our 10th anniversary, and believed that a quiet life was usually a good life. After she passed away from an illness that took far more than it should have, I found myself returning to the only place that still felt like home. The house had belonged to my parents before me and to my grandparents before them. Every room carried a memory that could not be replaced by fresh paint or expensive renovations. The hardwood floors still creaked in the same places where I used to race toy cars as a little boy. The kitchen window still caught the first rays of sunrise every autumn morning. The old, white oaks standing in the front yard had grown alongside every generation of my family, and every Thanksgiving someone inevitably took another photograph beneath its wide branches. I never cared that the house looked older than the neighboring properties. I cared that it still held the stories of the people who built my life. The neighborhood itself appeared almost perfect from the outside. Clean sidewalks stretched for blocks. Lawns looked as though they had been measured with rulers. Every mailbox matched. Every fence stood exactly the same height. The entrance featured a polished stone monument surrounded by colorful flowers that changed with every season. Visitors often described the community as peaceful. Residents proudly called it exclusive. I quickly learned that those two words meant very different things depending on who was speaking. Rebecca Whitmore introduced herself during my first week with a bright smile and a neatly organized welcome packet carrying the Homeowners Association logo across the front. She spoke with polished confidence and knew every resident by name. At first, she seemed genuinely helpful, pointing out community events, trash collection schedules, and landscaping guidelines. Nothing about that first conversation suggested that she viewed every interaction as a negotiation. She complimented my family home several times before casually asking whether I had ever considered selling it. I laughed politely and told her there was no price attached to family history. Her smile remained, but something behind her eyes quietly changed. From that moment forward, every conversation became just a little colder than the last. Within weeks, letters began appearing in my mailbox over details nobody else seemed to notice. My grass was supposedly 1 inch too high. My porch light was considered outdated. My mailbox required repainting even though it matched the neighborhood standards exactly. I complied whenever the requests were reasonable because I had no interest in arguing over trivial matters. What I did not realize then was that none of those notices were actually about landscaping, paint, or property maintenance. They were about patience. Rebecca was measuring mine while quietly revealing the limits of her own. I simply watched, listened, and remembered every single conversation because experience had taught me that people often reveal their intentions long before they realize someone is paying attention. The first invitation arrived on heavy cream-colored paper embossed with the Willow Creek Estate seal, requesting my attendance at the monthly Homeowners Association meeting. The language sounded polite enough, but every sentence carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had already decided the outcome before the discussion even began. I walked into the clubhouse that Thursday evening wearing the same navy sport coat I had owned for years, nodded to a few neighbors, poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee, and quietly took a seat near the back. Rebecca Whitmore stood confidently at the front of the room beneath bright recessed lights, speaking with the practiced rhythm of someone who enjoyed being the center of every conversation. Charts covered one wall, displaying colorful renderings of a proposed expansion that included a new clubhouse entrance, additional visitor parking, decorative landscaping, and a walking trail that curved elegantly through the neighborhood. As she clicked through each presentation slide, she spoke repeatedly about progress, modernization, and increasing property values. Then a map appeared on the large screen behind her. A thick red line cut directly across my front yard. The planned entrance would require the complete removal of my family's property. Rebecca smiled as though she were announcing wonderful news. She explained that acquiring my lot would create the perfect gateway into the community and elevate every surrounding home's value. She described my house as an unfortunate obstacle rather than a family residence. Several board members nodded without ever looking in my direction. Finally, Rebecca turned toward me and asked if I would like to comment. I stood slowly, thanked her for the presentation, and calmly explained that my property was not for sale. I told the room that some things carried value beyond dollars, and that my answer would remain the same, regardless of how many meetings were scheduled. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system overhead. Rebecca maintained her polished smile, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the remote control in her hand. She thanked me for sharing my opinion before immediately moving on to the next agenda item, as though my response meant nothing. The meeting ended with neighbors chatting casually over cookies and bottled water, yet conversation stopped whenever I walked nearby. During the following days, the atmosphere throughout the neighborhood shifted almost imperceptibly. Friendly waves disappeared. People who had introduced themselves weeks earlier suddenly became too busy to make eye contact. A contractor parked outside my house one afternoon, taking measurements from the sidewalk before leaving without knocking on my door. 2 days later, I received another certified letter claiming my driveway contained structural defects that required immediate correction despite having passed a county inspection only months before. Then came another notice regarding the height of decorative shrubs that had not changed since I moved in. Each letter carried Rebecca's signature. Each deadline became shorter than the last. Individually, they looked insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Rebecca was no longer asking me to cooperate. She was building pressure one carefully documented step at a time. convinced that enough inconvenience would eventually accomplish what persuasion had failed to achieve. She believed she was teaching me how power worked inside Willow Creek Estates. She had no idea that I had spent an entire career watching people mistake authority for control, and that those who relied most heavily on intimidation almost always underestimated the patience of someone who preferred facts over arguments. The pressure became so predictable that I could almost tell what day of the week it was by the envelope waiting inside my mailbox. Every Monday brought another notice. Every Wednesday, another inspection. Every Friday, another reminder that my property somehow failed to meet standards that seemed to change whenever Rebecca decided they should. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found a bright orange warning tag hanging from my front gate claiming the decorative fence along my driveway exceeded the approved height by 2 inches. I grabbed a tape measure from my garage, checked it twice, and smiled to myself when the measurement matched the original permit exactly. I took photographs from every angle, saved them with the date and time, and quietly filed them away. The following week, a landscaping crew arrived without notice and began trimming branches from the white oak near the sidewalk. I walked outside before they could begin cutting and politely asked who had authorized the work. The foreman looked uncomfortable before showing me a maintenance order carrying the Homeowners Association letterhead. The request listed the tree as a community hazard. I explained that the trunk stood entirely inside my property line and that county records clearly reflected that fact. The crew packed their equipment and left without arguing. But less than an hour later, Rebecca appeared at my front door wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy afternoon. She folded her hands neatly and told me that cooperation made life easier for everyone. I thanked her for the advice and replied that respecting property boundaries usually accomplished the same thing. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. Over the next several weeks, the inconveniences became increasingly creative. Temporary utility markings appeared across my lawn without explanation before disappearing again 2 days later. A survey team measured the front of my property while pretending they had the wrong address. Delivery drivers occasionally discovered anonymous complaints claiming my house number was displayed incorrectly even though it had not changed in decades. Neighbors who once waved during their evening walks now crossed the street before reaching my sidewalk, as though simply speaking with me might place them on the wrong side of the Homeowners Association. Even so, I refused to argue. Every evening, I organized documents across the dining room table where my mother used to serve Sunday dinners. I kept copies of every letter, every photograph, every timestamp, every receipt, and every email in carefully labeled folders. My routine never changed. Coffee, work, home, documentation, silence. Rebecca interpreted that silence as weakness because she believed confidence always sounded loud. What she never recognized was that calm people often see more than angry ones. Then came the first unusually cold night of the season. A steady wind moved through the neighborhood, carrying the dry scent of fallen leaves across the sidewalks while porch lights glowed warmly from nearly every house on the block. Before locking my front door, I glanced toward the street and noticed a white sport utility vehicle parked farther away than usual with its headlights turned off. It remained there only a few seconds before slowly pulling away without making a sound. I looked at the time on my watch, made a quiet mental note, and closed the curtains. At that moment, nothing seemed extraordinary. Looking back, I realized it was the final ordinary evening my family's home would ever know. The night everything changed began with a silence that felt almost unnatural. The steady breeze from earlier had disappeared, leaving the neighborhood unusually still, as though the entire subdivision had decided to hold its breath. I woke a little after 2 o'clock in the morning because of an unfamiliar sound outside my bedroom window. It was not loud enough to alarm me immediately, just a faint metallic click followed by what sounded like tires rolling slowly across pavement. I sat up, looked through the curtains, and saw nothing except darkness stretching across the quiet street. After a few moments, I returned to bed, assuming it had been a delivery truck taking a wrong turn or a neighbor arriving home later than usual. Less than 10 minutes later, my smoke detector shattered the silence with its piercing alarm. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and moved quickly toward the hallway where a faint haze had already begun drifting near the ceiling. The smell reached me before I saw anything else, a sharp mixture of smoke, heated wood, and melting insulation that spread through every room with startling speed. I followed the emergency plan my father had taught me decades earlier, moving directly toward the nearest exit without stopping to gather belongings that could always be replaced. Once outside, I turned and watched flashing emergency lights begin appearing at the far end of the street as neighbors stepped onto their front porches wrapped in blankets and jackets. Firefighters arrived within minutes and immediately took control of the scene with calm professionalism. They worked methodically until sunrise painted the eastern sky with pale orange light, and when the last streams of water finally stopped, very little remained standing. I thanked every firefighter who walked past me because they had done everything anyone could reasonably ask under impossible circumstances. Investigators soon began their examination, placing small evidence markers around the property while carefully photographing every section of the site. They spoke very little, occasionally comparing notes before continuing their work. I answered every question honestly, signed the requested statements, and then stepped back to let them do their jobs. Across the street, Rebecca arrived shortly after dawn carrying a travel coffee cup as though she were attending another ordinary community meeting. She expressed sympathy in a voice polished enough to sound convincing to anyone who had not known the previous months as well as I had. She even suggested that older homes often developed hidden electrical problems despite proper maintenance. I simply thanked her for her concern and offered no further comment. Silence once again encouraged her confidence. While investigators continued searching through the debris, I noticed something lying near the cracked stone walkway that had once led to my front porch. Half buried beneath gray ash was a silver lighter engraved with a distinctive compass design. I had seen that design before during one of the Homeowners Association board meetings, resting casually on the conference table beside a stack of Rebecca's folders. Without attracting attention, I picked it up carefully using a clean handkerchief and slipped it into my coat pocket before anyone else looked in my direction. I did not know whether it would ultimately matter, but experience had taught me that facts rarely announce their importance when you first discover them. Sometimes they wait quietly until every other piece finally falls into place, and I had the distinct feeling that this small forgotten object had just become the first voice prepared to tell the truth. The official investigation moved forward exactly the way serious investigations always do, slowly enough to frustrate everyone who expected immediate answers and carefully enough to preserve every fact. Insurance representatives photographed every remaining beam. County investigators collected samples from multiple locations across the property. Utility companies examined electrical equipment before making any conclusions. Everyone seemed willing to wait except Rebecca. Less than 24 hours after the fire, she was already telling neighbors that the unfortunate incident proved why aging homes created unnecessary risks for the entire community. By the second day, she was openly discussing redevelopment plans as though my family's property had already become an empty lot waiting for new construction. I heard those conversations without responding because people who believe they have already won usually stop guarding their words. Instead of confronting anyone, I spent my mornings inside a temporary rental house organizing every document I had collected during the previous months. The violation notices went into one folder, the certified letters into another. Photographs, timestamps, property surveys, maintenance records, inspection reports, and every email exchange each found their proper place. On the dining table rested the silver lighter sealed inside a clear evidence pouch I had purchased from a legal supply store years earlier. I never touched it directly after the morning I found it. Every action became deliberate because details matter long before anyone realizes why. 2 days after the fire, I received a call from an independent fire investigator assigned by the insurance company. He politely explained that several findings required additional review and asked whether I could meet him that afternoon. When I arrived, he showed me nothing confidential, offered no speculation, and made no promises. He simply asked precise questions about recent disputes involving the property, unusual visitors, and previous complaints filed with the Homeowners Association. I answered every question honestly and handed him copies of documents instead of opinions. Facts speak more clearly when emotions stay out of the conversation. As I prepared to leave, he thanked me for maintaining such detailed records and quietly remarked that very few homeowners documented routine interactions so consistently. I smiled and replied that old habits from a legal career were difficult to abandon. He nodded without asking another question. That evening, Rebecca appeared on the local community's social media page expressing sympathy once again, while encouraging residents to support the association's vision for a safer and more modern neighborhood. Hundreds of comments followed praising her leadership. Reading them did not anger me. Public opinion often arrives long before the complete truth. I closed my laptop, poured another cup of black coffee, and looked through the front window of the rental house toward the setting sun. 3 days had passed since the fire. 3 days since Rebecca had watched my home disappear with complete confidence that the story was over. The next morning, I put on a charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a burgundy tie that had remained untouched in my closet for weeks. I polished my black shoes until they reflected the hallway lights, gathered a slim leather briefcase, and drove toward the county courthouse before sunrise. Rebecca believed she was attending another routine hearing connected to insurance claims and property disputes. She had no reason to suspect that the quiet homeowner she had spent months trying to pressure would soon enter the building through a door she had never even noticed. The courthouse always smelled the same in the early morning, a quiet mixture of polished wood, fresh coffee, and old paper that carried decades of history within its walls. By 7:30, the hallways had begun, filling with attorneys carrying leather briefcases, deputies greeting familiar faces, and clerks preparing files for the day's calendar. I entered through the private judicial entrance as I had done countless times before, exchanging a simple nod with the security officer who wished me a good morning without another word. Routine has a way of making extraordinary moments arrive without warning. Inside my chambers, I placed my briefcase on the desk, removed my watch, and reviewed the schedule one final time. The matter involving insurance disputes and related preliminary proceedings connected to my property had been assigned through the normal administrative process weeks before the fire ever occurred. Judicial ethics required impartiality above everything else, and every procedural question regarding assignment and disclosure had already been addressed according to established court rules before the hearing could proceed. Facts, not surprises, governed a courtroom. Even so, I knew one moment would arrive that no amount of preparation could soften. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca Whitmore arrived nearly 30 minutes early wearing another tailored cream-colored suit and carrying a stack of organized folders. She laughed comfortably with one of the Homeowners Association board members while occasionally pointing toward documents that she appeared eager to present. From the hallway security camera, I later learned she seemed entirely relaxed, greeting nearly everyone she recognized with effortless confidence. She still believed she understood the room better than anyone else inside it. At precisely 8:30, the courtroom doors opened. Attorneys entered first, followed by investigators, insurance representatives, and several curious residents from Willow Creek Estates who had heard enough neighborhood rumors to fill every public seat. Rebecca took her place at the plaintiff's table with the composed expression of someone expecting another procedural victory. She glanced casually toward the empty bench once or twice before returning to quiet conversation. Then the courtroom deputy stepped forward. His voice carried through the room with practiced clarity. "All rise." Every chair moved almost simultaneously. Conversation stopped. Papers settled. The room became completely silent except for the faint sound of shoes crossing the carpet behind the side entrance. I walked through the doorway wearing a black judicial robe instead of the navy sport coat Rebecca had seen so many times before. My expression remained exactly as calm as it had been throughout every encounter we had shared over the previous months. I looked neither surprised nor satisfied. I simply took my place behind the bench, arranged the case file before me, and acknowledged the courtroom. Only then did I lift my eyes toward the gallery. Rebecca was still standing, but the confidence that had defined every previous conversation had quietly disappeared. Her eyes widened in unmistakable recognition as the realization reached her one piece at a time. The quiet homeowner she had dismissed, pressured, and underestimated was the same county judge whose courtroom she had just entered. She instinctively looked toward her attorney, searching for an explanation that did not exist. I offered none. Personal history had no place in what would follow. The only thing that mattered inside that courtroom was the evidence, the law, and the truth. And for the first time since I had moved into Willow Creek Estates, Rebecca Whitmore understood that those were three things she could neither influence nor intimidate. Once everyone was seated, The courtroom settled into the familiar rhythm that never changes regardless of who occupies the seats. Every statement was recorded. Every exhibit received a number. Every objection followed established procedure. Outside those walls, rumors and emotions could spread freely. Inside, only admissible facts were permitted to speak. Rebecca regained part of her composure after the initial shock, convincing herself that procedure alone might still protect her confidence. Her attorney adjusted his glasses, organized several binders, and began presenting what appeared to be a straightforward dispute involving insurance coverage and property conditions. The argument suggested that years of deferred maintenance had created an unfortunate chain of events beyond anyone's control. It was carefully prepared, professionally delivered, and supported by photographs that revealed only part of the story. Then the witnesses began. The independent fire investigator testified first, explaining the documented examination process, the collection of physical evidence, and the reasons additional testing had been requested. He spoke without emotion, relying entirely upon reports, measurements, and laboratory findings. Next came a county surveyor who confirmed that my property boundaries had never interfered with public land or community infrastructure despite repeated claims made in multiple homeowners association notices. After that, maintenance contractors testified that they had received unusual requests to inspect, photograph, and estimate work on my property months before any legitimate construction project had been approved. Each witness added another small piece to a puzzle that gradually formed a picture no prepared speech could erase. My attorney then introduced a series of exhibits that I had quietly preserved throughout the previous months. Every certified letter appeared in chronological order. Every inspection notice carried timestamps. Every photograph displayed accurate dates and measurements. The courtroom monitors showed side-by-side comparisons proving that several alleged violations had been cited even though conditions had remained unchanged. A quiet murmur moved through the public gallery before disappearing beneath the deputy's reminder to remain silent. Rebecca's confident posture slowly became noticeably more rigid. The most revealing moment arrived when the evidence technician described the chain of custody surrounding the silver lighter recovered near the stone walkway. The engraved compass design matched photographs taken during multiple homeowners association meetings, including one image posted publicly months earlier, in which the same lighter rested beside Rebecca's notebook during a board session. The technician offered no conclusions beyond identification because conclusions belonged elsewhere. Facts alone were enough. Additional digital evidence followed. Security camera recordings from neighboring homes established an accurate timeline of vehicle movements during the hours surrounding the incident. Cellular location records obtained through lawful process placed several relevant devices within a remarkably narrow area. Financial records introduced through proper authentication showed ongoing discussions about redevelopment costs and projected increases in neighborhood revenue if my property became available. None of those exhibits independently answered every question. Together, they created a consistent sequence that was impossible to ignore. Throughout the hearing, I remained exactly where every judge belongs, listening more than speaking and allowing the process to unfold according to the law rather than personal history. Rebecca occasionally glanced toward me, perhaps expecting anger, satisfaction, or some visible sign of revenge. She found none. A courtroom is not a stage for personal victories. It is a place where patience, documentation, and truth eventually outweigh influence, assumptions, and carefully crafted appearances, and by the time the final exhibit had been admitted into the record, the silence inside the courtroom carried far more weight than any speech ever could. The proceedings concluded exactly as every proper legal proceeding should, not with dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts, but with a careful review of the record that had been created piece by piece through evidence, testimony, and established law. Every exhibit had been admitted according to procedure. Every witness had been examined and cross-examined. Every party had been given a full opportunity to present its position. When the final arguments ended, the courtroom became remarkably still. It is amazing how quiet a room can become when everyone understands that opinions no longer matter and only facts remain. I reviewed my notes one last time before speaking. My words were measured because justice deserves precision rather than performance. I explained that the court's responsibility was not to reward assumptions or punish personalities, but to evaluate credible evidence under the law. The documented record established a consistent pattern of targeted administrative actions, inaccurate violation notices, coordinated pressure concerning the property, and significant factual inconsistencies surrounding the events that followed. Matters requiring criminal determination would continue through the appropriate authorities, while the civil issues before the court would be resolved according to the evidence presented. The rulings that followed reflected those findings. Several claims advanced by the Homeowners Association were dismissed. Preservation orders remained in place for additional evidence. Financial actions affecting disputed redevelopment plans were suspended pending further proceedings. Independent investigators retained full authority to continue their work without interference. Around the courtroom, nobody celebrated because real justice rarely sounds like applause. It sounds like pages turning, pens writing, and a clerk carefully entering orders into the official record. Rebecca remained seated for several long moments after everyone else began gathering their papers. The confidence that had once followed her into every neighborhood meeting had quietly disappeared. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed to understand that authority borrowed from titles or committees could disappear overnight, while accountability had a way of waiting patiently until every fact found its proper place. Weeks later, I returned to the property where my family's home had once stood. The debris had been cleared away, leaving only open ground, the old stone walkway, and the white oak that somehow continued reaching toward the sky. Fresh autumn leaves covered the soil where generations of memories had once lived. I stood there with a set of architectural drawings rolled beneath one arm, not because I intended to recreate the past exactly as it had been, but because some foundations deserve another beginning. One of my neighbors, a young boy riding his bicycle after school, slowed as he reached the edge of the property. He looked at the empty lot, then at the plans in my hand, and asked with the simple honesty only children possess, "Are you building your new house here?" I smiled, looked toward the old oak tree, and answered, "I am building a new chapter." He nodded as though that made perfect sense before riding away down the sidewalk. I remained there for another minute, listening to the wind moving gently through the surviving branches. My family's house had not survived, but the principles my parents taught me had never depended on walls or rooftops. Patience still mattered. Integrity still mattered. Truth still mattered. In the end, the strongest foundation any person can leave behind is not concrete or timber. It is the quiet certainty that when power is challenged by facts, facts eventually win, because justice does not need to raise its voice. It only needs the truth to arrive.